Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Prophets Joshua chapter 6 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're diving straight into one of the most famous events in history, the fall of Jericho.
So here is our game plan for this explainer. 1. Context and the shut city. 2. The divine battle plan. 3. Marching for 6 days. 4. The 7th day climax. 5. The devoted city. And finally, 6. Lessons and final recap. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, Context and the Shut City. Let's see exactly what the Israelites are facing right as the chapter begins.
All right, verse 1 sets the stage perfectly. It tells us that this heavily fortified city of Jericho is just completely, tightly shut up. In the original Hebrew text, the phrase used is sogeret umasugeret, which basically translates to shut up inside and out. We're talking an absolute panicked lockdown. The text specifically emphasizes that literally no one went out and no one came in. But why the total paralysis? Well, from earlier chapters, we know the Canaanites had heard exactly what the God of Israel did to the Egyptians at the Red Sea 40 years prior. And more recently, they heard about the utter defeat of those powerful Amorite kings Sihon and Og just across the Jordan River. Because of all this history, the people of Jericho are absolutely terrified of the approaching Israelites. They've locked their massive gates, barred their doors, the whole shebang. No one's leaving for supplies and no one's coming in for refuge. This impenetrable obstacle is what's standing right in front of Joshua and the people.
Section 2, the Divine Battle Plan. Faced with these massive walls, God gives Joshua a very unusual strategy in verses 2 through 5.
Right in verse 2, God actually assures Joshua that Jericho is already delivered into his hands, along with its king and its mighty men of valor. From a divine perspective, it's a done deal. But the method? Wow, it's truly fascinating. God outlines this clear, 4-step procedure that's centered around a disciplined march, not a traditional military assault. To really appreciate this, you have to think about standard Bronze Age warfare. Normally, an ancient siege meant building massive earthen ramps, using heavy battering rams, or just starving the city out for months or even years. But God's strategy here is entirely radical. The armed men are commanded to march around the city just once a day for 6 consecutive days. 7 priests will carry horns in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And then, on the 7th day, the routine drastically changes to 7 full marches, ending in a massive unified shout. Notice something? There are absolutely no traditional weapons drawn against the stone.
Now, to clarify what's going on in the text, the 7 priests are told to carry very specific instruments. The Hebrew text calls them shofarat hayovalim, which translates to ram's horns. And this is a really vital distinction for understanding the plain meaning of the text. These aren't your standard crafted silver war trumpets, which are known in Hebrew as hatzatzrot, that a military commander would typically use to direct troops or sound an alarm. Nope, these are natural ram's horns. They're the exact same instruments used to proclaim the Jubilee year, of release, freedom, and divine sovereignty. By mandating the use of shofarat, God is clearly signaling that this is not a conventional battle of human military strength. It's a divine spiritual declaration. These horns are going to be blown continuously to lead the procession, marching right ahead of the Ark of the Covenant, which of course represents the presence and authority of God himself.
Section 3, Marching for 6 days. Let's look at verses 6 through 9, where Joshua puts this plan into action.
Joshua relays these exact instructions to the priests and the people, and they immediately get into their formations. This perfectly illustrates the sheer orderliness of the event. Just picture this procession in your mind. The armed forces are taking the lead at the absolute front. Following them are the 7 priests, continuously blowing those ram's horns. Right behind the priests is the sacred Ark of the Covenant. And finally, a rear guard trails behind the Ark. So the military forces are placed at the front and the back, perfectly flanking and protecting the sacred center. The soldiers, they really aren't the main event here. Their position highlights the utmost reverence being given to the Ark. They are conducting a holy procession, protecting the divine presence, rather than putting on a standard military parade.
Now, what is truly mind-blowing about verse 10 is the incredible test of obedience it requires. Joshua commands this massive crowd of armed men to remain in total, absolute silence. He tells them, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. I mean, think about the profound psychological warfare at play here. Imagine how eerie and intimidating it must have been for those Canaanite guards standing up on Jericho's walls. They're looking down at thousands of armed enemy soldiers marching in a massive circle, and there is dead silence. No taunting, no battle cries, no clashing of swords against shields, nothing. Just the rhythmic sound of thousands of marching footfalls and the continuous piercing blast of the 7 ram's horns echoing against the stone walls.
Verses 11 through 14 describe this patient, repetitive routine in detail. For 6 straight days, they wake up early, march around the imposing walls of Jericho just one time, and then they simply return to camp and spend the night there. The mundanity of days 2 through 5 is really striking. The Israelite army wakes up, performs the march, sees absolutely zero structural damage to the thick stone walls, and goes back to sleep. Nothing changes on day 1 or day 2 or day 3. They just silently do the work. It requires an immense amount of discipline to repeat a seemingly illogical task, day after day, without complaining, trusting purely in the word of Joshua and the instruction of God.
Section 4. The seventh-day climax. Everything changes when we hit verse 15.
The narrative drastically shifts here because the highly anticipated 7th day finally arrives. The text notes that on this specific day, they wake up very early, right at the crack of dawn, and the routine suddenly changes. They compass the city after the same manner, but not just once. On this final day, they march around the massive city 7 full times. This would require extraordinary physical stamina. Marching in full armor, in the heat of the region, for 7 continuous laps in absolute silence, that drastically escalates the physical endurance required. It also builds the spiritual and narrative intensity to its absolute peak. The tension among the Israelites marching and the terror among the inhabitants of Jericho watching must have been completely overwhelming.
Then in verse 16, on that pivotal 7th pass, the priests sound a long final blast on the horns. And at this precise climactic moment, Joshua finally breaks that agonizing 6-day silence. He commands the Israelites, "Shout, for the Lord hath given you this city." All of that restrained energy, the total silence of the entire week, is just unleashed in one massive unified roar. The long period of silent waiting and discipline is officially over.
Section 5, the devoted city. Before the walls actually come down, we need to cover some essential rules.
Verses 17 through 19 lay out absolutely crucial ground rules about how the Israelites are to handle this soon-to-be conquered city. Joshua explicitly warns the people that the city and absolutely everything in it is to be devoted to the Lord. The Hebrew word used here is Cherem, which means something uniquely set apart. Now you might be wondering, why was Jericho designated as Cherem? Well, in the plain historical context, Jericho was the very first city conquered in the Promised Land, so it basically acted as the first fruits offering, entirely dedicated to God rather than the soldiers. Joshua clarifies that taking any of these devoted items for personal gain would literally bring a deadly curse and sheer destruction upon the entire Israelite camp. They cannot take standard spoils of war here. The wealth of the city simply doesn't belong to them.
Joshua outlines 3 strict rules before the final charge. First, Rahab the harlot and all who are in her house are to be spared and allowed to live. This is super important because, if you remember back in chapter 2, she recognized the God of Israel and faithfully hid the Israelite messengers who were sent to scout the city. So that promise absolutely must be kept. Second, aside from her family, every living thing in the city is to be utterly destroyed, fulfilling that Cherem decree. And third, all the precious metals, the silver, the gold, the articles of bronze and iron, are considered completely sacred to the Lord. They are not to be pocketed by soldiers. They have to be respectfully placed directly into the treasury of the Lord.
Verses 20 and 21 detail the spectacular physical climax we've all been waiting for. When the trumpets sound, the people unleash a great, loud shout, and miraculously, the impenetrable walls of Jericho fall completely flat. If we look closely at the Hebrew in verse 20, the literal translation says the wall fell taktiha, meaning it fell under it or in its place. Basically, the massive walls sank right into the ground or collapsed flat upon their own foundation. It's like a controlled implosion. Because of this specific type of collapse, there is absolutely no need for the Israelites to build siege ramps or scale giant mounds of treacherous rubble. Every single man is able to march straight ahead, charging right into the city on level ground to conquer it and execute the devoted destruction exactly as God commanded. Even in the absolute chaos of the city falling and the massive conquest that follows, Joshua demonstrates profound integrity. He honors his commitments. In verses 22 through 25, he commands the very 2 men who had originally spied out the land to rush into the crumbling city. They go straight to Rahab's house and rescue her, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all her relatives. They bring them safely out, fulfilling the solemn oath they made to her. Interestingly, the text notes they brought them outside the camp of Israel initially. This was a necessary step for ritual purification before they could enter the holy camp. After this purification, the text confirms she lived among the Israelites from that day forward.
Finally, in verse 26, after the Israelites have burned the entire city and everything in it with fire, Joshua issues a severe prophetic oath. He declares,
Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and builds this city, even Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn shall he lay the foundation thereof, and with the loss of his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. The destruction of Jericho is meant to be a permanent monument to God's power. And what's incredibly surprising, and really proves the exactness of the biblical text, is that hundreds of years later, this curse was literally fulfilled. Over in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34, a man named Hiel the Bethelite rebuilt Jericho. And exactly as Joshua prophesied, Hiel laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son Abiram and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Segub. It's pretty wild to see that come full circle.
Section 6. Lessons and final recap. Let's pull everything together and see what we can learn from this. Let's take a step back and look at this deeply historical and fascinating chapter to extract the plain, straightforward lessons it offers for our own lives today. The simple, primary meaning of the text shows us a massive contrast between human military might and divine intervention. The Israelites didn't use battering rams or siege ramps, right? They used radical obedience. It was God's intervention that brought the walls down, not the strength of the soldiers. On top of that, we see immense integrity on display. Even in the middle of a chaotic, massive conquest, Joshua ensured the leaders paused to make sure the promise to Rahab was faithfully and completely kept.
On a highly practical level, this explainer teaches us the profound value of disciplined patience. Sometimes in our own lives, we find ourselves stuck in our own 6 days of silent waiting. We might be doing the right things daily, following the precise steps we're supposed to take, but we just don't see the walls moving or cracking at all. This chapter reminds us to silently, diligently, and faithfully do the daily work. We must trust the process and maintain our discipline, even when it feels repetitive or kind of illogical, before we finally see our own massive obstacles fall.
To quickly summarize Chapter 6, Jericho was completely sealed tight in terror. Israel marched precisely as commanded in absolute silence for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. At the final, unified shout, the mighty walls fell flat right in their place. Israel respected the strict rules regarding the devoted treasury items, and they faithfully saved Rahab and her entire family.
But this does leave us with a lingering question as they stand in the burning rubble surrounded by gold and silver. Will the Israelites successfully resist the extreme temptation of the devoted items in the ruins of Jericho? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.